Hello, welcome to the 9th episode of Peter York's Culture Wars House Party. I'm Peter York and my podcast is about culture wars, the way modern politics is so often played out with symbols and scapegoats, with lying and astroturf organisations instead of the real things and the big debates. I'll be talking to the players and the commentators in these culture wars and getting them to explain what they think is really happening. We'll have some fun and some gossip, and we'll ask some really vital questions, like who makes the best suede loafers in Jermyn Street. Now, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown is a journalist, an author, she's written 22 books, and a broadcaster. She's a familiar face on TV and a familiar voice on radio, and she's all over YouTube. She's been doing it for over 40 years. She's a brown woman, a Ugandan Asian of Indian descent who came here in 1972 from Uganda after university there to go to Oxford, where she did an MPhil in literature. After that, she taught. She didn't go into journalism until her 30s. She certainly made up for lost time. In the Blair years, she seemed to be on everything, and she was garlanded with honours, including an MBE in 2001, which she later gave back, and all sorts of commentator of the year type recognition. Newspapers and broadcasters like her inspiring honesty because she's so clearly not obligated to party, to religious or ethnic groups. She's actually a Shia Muslim of a rather particular kind, or to commercial interests. She's managed to get attacked and trolled by practically everyone. So, for instance, the Boris-loving people of the world were furious when she said that his father, Stanley, was a wife-beater who'd broken his wife's nose. And she said that on BBC Question Time. She's still very much around, pointing out culture wars, disinformation and plain lies, pressure and censorship. And she now detects a mood of caution and deplatforming in UK mainstream media. Good morning, Yasmin.
Good morning, Peter.
Let's get right in there. What subjects and people do you think are being avoided and deplatformed in UK mainstream media now?
Well, we certainly, absolutely. The first thing is, all this hysteria about deplatforming by students or lefties or whatever, when the real deplatforming is happening in the centre, in our institutions, our main communications institutions, I would say, where certain voices have just kind of been vanished, who at one point were, as should be in a lively democracy, a real democracy, in the public space, you got these voices arguing. Increasingly, I have noticed, nobody says they've been deplatformed, but I remember when I was on Question Time making the remarks you've just quoted, that was after a 6-7 year hiatus. And very interesting to me because it was over those years that I moved steadily more. I was always on the left, but I became more left-wing in those years, mainly because of the man-made and woman-made inequality I saw all around me getting worse and worse and worse. So it's very interesting to me that free speech is for everybody on the right, but not for those of us on the left. And it's very telling if you compare the number of times Nigel Farage, we all know, has been on more than 35 times on Question Time. And when you look up how many times Jeremy Corbyn has been on, who was the leader of a main political party, who had a huge following, and you will see what I mean. It's almost like we all have to agree Jeremy should not be on because he's just not trustworthy, whatever. And so there is a kind of double game going on here. I don't have an English word for it, but somebody probably does, which is on the one hand, the accusations are all directed at the left, which doesn't have power, certainly not the kind of power that culture warriors are accusing them of having, perhaps at universities, a little bit more liberal left, but other than that. And at the same time, those same people are making sure that certain voices are silenced. It's a really interesting trick they're playing on us here.
And who do you think sets these policies, and who's pressuring them?
Well, it's interesting. Quite a lot of people I know have left the BBC in the last 3 years. And at the point they left, they were wrecked. And not many of them, some of them have told them the constant struggles they had at quite a micro level on who would and would not be on programs. And I'll tell you, this just happened. My agent, who's a frightfully active bloke and works very hard for the people he takes care of, told me just the other day that he was talking to Newsnight, where I used to be on a lot. I haven't been on for at least 6 years. And he said, why not? Can she be on? And at first he was said, yeah, of course, we really like her, blah, blah, blah. And then the other person he was pushing was Arlene Phillips, the judge on
Dance Lady.
Strictly Come Dancing. And so she got a gig on there. And he said to them, well, what about Yasmin Alibhai-Brown? And they said to him, oh, well, the person he was talking to said to him, oh, well, I've checked with the bosses and we're not planning to have her on anytime soon. Now, you and I know that these news programs decide their guest lists, or thought we did, on the day. Okay? What does it mean we're not planning to have her on? What does that mean? I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but tell me, there might be a story for which I would be perfect. Have they said in this plan, we must never have her?
Yes.
It was a careless remark.
Yes.
But an important one. It just happened.
Yeah.
So there is obviously some schedule of people we must try never to have on.
Yes.
At the BBC.
Yes. But how is it put together and by whom? In an ancient time, there was the colonel at the end of the corridor in Broadcasting House who remained unnamed for practically centuries, and he had files, and the files consisted of lefties, brackets, communists, and they were decorated with Christmas trees. And then they said, that's over with. This never happens now.
Yeah. Well, it does. Actually, it does. And these friends of mine, or people I knew who left, really struggled because they really believed in the mission. They believed in the mission, to explain, to inform, to entertain. And the number of times they have said, they were told they couldn't have so-and-so on, not by their own editors often, but by their editors saying, we have been told no. So this goes on, and it's not just the BBC. I remember until 7 years ago, this is absolutely true, when Paul Dacre was the editor of the Daily Mail, I was getting commissioned every week to do big pieces, being paid £1 a word.
Oof.
Which is a lot of money.
Yes.
For a lefty. And, and they would commission it. They never trapped me into saying anything I didn't want to say. At 9 o'clock, the phone would ring and the headline writer would check with me that I was happy with the headlines. I've never been asked this by the iPaper or the Independent, where I worked for 17 years, or my present paper, I. Because Dacre insisted, he respected me that much. And when the Independent behaved rather badly and sacked a whole lot of us, mostly women, I actually had a letter, which I still have, I hope it's read at my memorial, from Dacre himself on an old typewriter. I can imagine him using two fingers typing it, saying, I bow to no one in my respect for you as a journalist. So there was a time when even the right-wing press understood the need to have left-wing arguments. So I wrote for them about how people on benefits were really suffering, not that they were screwing the state. I think I got £4,000 for that, and it had 3
Blimey.
pages. I spent 2 days there with a photographer by my side. I felt so important. I wrote pro-immigration pieces. I did all kinds of things. That just vanished. The mood has changed so much. And now this is not a cry for me. I'm really, I've worked hard, I've worked long, I've had my time. But it's the younger people who hold views which are so important for us to hear, who are also being censored. They're demonized. Generation Z is demonized as cafe-drinking, useless lefties who can't stand argument, all of this, but also being denied the space to make those arguments in these culture wars. They are spoken about, but never given the right to speak. And it's become such an embedded part of the culture. It's groupthink. Oh, there's a very good term I used in one of my columns this week on how the media has become the wind beneath Farage's wings, if you remember the song, and how the media has not done its job. And what that has resulted in is what psychologists call a hive mind.
What does that mean?
So it usually applies to communes.
Yep.
Where there is a kind of collective way of thinking, and any criticism, any question is seen as a deadly threat, and the air circulates between themselves. Fresh air never comes in. And those are used for commune people, but now it's on a mass scale, I said in my column, applying to all those who voted for reform in the last elections. Okay? Now, how did this happen? It happened because the media, which should be the custodians, if you like, of truths, have instead joined this airless space and encouraged it. Am I making sense?
Absolute. But what's driving it? Is it a global sense of caution? Is it particular to the UK? Is it particular to the last days of the Tories or the first days of Labour? How is it being engineered?
Well, I can't say that I'm an expert on Germany or France, but I do know that the world's biggest democracy, India, turned very authoritarian and intolerant of alternative views or the kind of openness it was famous for after independence, because a Hindu fundamentalist took over and the hive mind. It's an example of the hive mind where he wins elections and we know what he is like, that he was charged with doing nothing while Muslims were being massacred in the Gujarat where he was a governor, and the people who have accused him have been imprisoned and the keys thrown away, more or less. So there were places where it was happening, and certainly where I grew up, there was no free speech. So I grew up with that, and which is why I value it so much. There was no free speech, incidentally, under the empire either. I was born during the empire, and there were so many things we couldn't say and do, and so many things we had to do. So in pockets, you've seen it happening at one point in Brazil. But now, of course, we see America, we see in Germany, certainly since the Gaza war, how thin that veneer of openness was. But I do think that we in Britain have a very secretive state anyway. This is a very secretive state. Christ, when I first found out what right honourable meant, I almost had a fit. That there were elected members of parliament, some of whom were given secrets of the state and others were not. Now, why? Why do we have a two-tier parliamentary system? I remember, anyway, so in our secretive state, this kind of exclusion, this kind of sort of silent war on alternative points of view, which often are the more truthful points of view, are much easier to manage. And so it is.
Well, if you look at what's happening in the USA right now, as far as I can understand, from what I read, from what I watch, from what people tell me from there is a real drive towards censorship based on key words. Organisations and people who utter or write key words get struck out. It seems quite extraordinary when Americans talk constantly about free speech and maintaining free speech as a great American value. But if you can have whole rafts of noted authors struck out, and apparently other noted authors like Adolf Hitler unstruck out, then you think, what exactly is going on?
Yeah, and I think the Americans are horrified by this. What we don't get to hear enough, I mean, really, honestly, the BBC night after night should be featuring those Americans who are appalled, who are fighting, who are demonstrating, who are doing what they can, who are using the law to stop this dictator in the making. Or he may even be there already. All we get is, all their MAGA supporters and why he's great for the country. But I think it's a good shock for Americans because I think people can take these things for granted. And the culture wars there were launched a long time ago. I wrote a book some years ago called In Defense of Political Correctness. The money to fight political correctness, which is nothing more than civility, the right for people of all backgrounds should have to speak, to be, to grow, to thrive, equalizing in the public space, women and men, Black and Asian people and white people, those with no power, the working classes. And it was so demonized with the backing of dark American money, which was completely behind it, then became what really backed the onslaught on other countries. So they exported their money here, and people like Melanie Phillips and others, and including Simon Hogarth of The Guardian, launching these wars against political correctness because their own worlds were threatened. And we've had the same thing happened with the culture wars now. The vocabulary changes. The woke is no different from politically correct. But what is interesting now and frightening is that Black Lives Matter, which really did shake up much of America, is now almost a banned notion. It's actually a banned notion. My best friend is American, and she tells me what's going on at a micro level. Books are being thrown out from libraries by parents demanding that no children's books or other books, well, mainly children's books and teen books, should contain references to homosexuality. This in a free country, people are being banned from speaking, and they do this in the name of free speech, like they do here. I mean, the Telegraph is one of the most pernicious papers we have, and not an hour goes by without them getting hold of some non-story to say the woke are killing free speech, and they do it in order to kill the woke. Do you see what I'm saying here?
I do. Once on YouTube, I saw a woman, an author interviewed who'd just written a book on wokeness. And the first question, as you might imagine, that let's say it was CNN, asked her was to define woke. And she said, "Oh dear, I knew you would ask me that. It's quite a difficult thing." She was completely unable to define what woke was as an integrated system of belief or action or anything else at all. So I do believe it sounds very much like PC when you got the group of puppets saying, "Political correctness gone mad." Do you remember? It was a very, very funny, but the same thing.
It's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing. And it was so interesting. I was at a lecture given by my friend Gary Young last night about a book he's written about being black and in the public space and a writer and the various pressures on all of us. I consider myself black, politically black, which was a thing we did before, but that all changed. Anyway, and he said he had written a piece in The Guardian yesterday about how many millions of colonial subjects who fought in the two world wars. And that today, only a quarter of British people who cannot stop talking about the wars even know that. Only a quarter. And some of them were real heroes. So he said, he quoted this response he got on email from somebody called Linda, he said, who said to him, "You were clearly a DNI hire. Your days are over. Wokeism is dead. You are finished." And he said, "I've been a journalist for over 35 years. When did I become a DNI hire, who only got his job because I'm black or because he was black?" So there's a whole new vocabulary. There's a whole new collapse of virtue, and virtue is a good word, by the way, that had developed in institutions and businesses after Black Lives Matter and Me Too, either because they didn't mean it or because they're so cowardly. And we are, I fear, in a period of the politics of tyranny and the politics of cowardice. And that is the scary thing. Just today, I've signed a letter, again, a second letter to the BBC. The first one was about the program that they broadcast on the children of Gaza. And it was discovered that one of the children featured was the son of an agriculture minister in Hamas. And they've withdrawn that from iPlayer. And a good number of us journalists from the TV and print sector have been sending letters in protest about that. Today I hear they're withholding a new documentary on the war in Gaza on medics. Why is this happening? Who is telling the BBC not to run a program on the number of medics who have been killed, some deliberately, some who are being tortured as we speak? Now, I'm quite simple-minded in some ways. I make simple connections. If one of the most powerful people at the BBC, at the top of the tower, is Robbie Gibbs, who is a known ferocious Zionist who owns, we think, or we don't know for sure, the Jewish Chronicle, which is a kind of really quite fanatically Zionist newspaper. I have nothing against Zionism.
It wasn't always.
No, but now it is and has been through three editors, the last three editors. Could it be that he's had some influence? Can Samir Shah, who happens to be a friend of mine, would he please answer this question? Why this special treatment for programs on Gaza? And I think since we are paying their fees and their wages, and most people in Britain, as in the world, are deeply concerned about Gaza, why is this happening?
But remember, what the Gazan people lose will be a gain to world tourism because Donald Trump has said so.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes.
That it will become the Riviera of the Middle East.
This week, I actually did something which I may regret. I don't know, because there are forces out there. But I thought I have to say this in a tweet, that Israel is a terrorist state. It is terrorizing civilian Palestinians, and the US, UK, and EU are arming Israel so it can carry on terrorizing them. And the rich Arab nations in Egypt are sitting by and not helping the terrorized, and that the terrorized people will not survive. I think there was about 7,500 people saw it so far. Let's use the language we need to use. I don't want to hear it's the only democracy in the Middle East anymore, because it's not, okay? Just because people voted for you didn't give you the right to do what you're doing.
Now, interesting thing about the BBC, which I admire in its original construction, though there are fault lines which were set in the 1920s, and I want to exist forever because otherwise we'd be like America and we have totally fragmented and polarized and all that stuff. And interesting about the coverage of Israel, Gaza, the West Bank, etc., Louis Theroux presented recently a very critical program about settlers and settler ideology and settler violence. Did you see that?
Yes, and I also saw how he's been trashed.
Oh.
On social media.
Well, what are they saying? That he's a...
Oh, he was biased. Some very big names have said it. This is the thing. Some very big names are, at the moment, doing what I never expected them to do. But yes, it was a phenomenal program. And for that, I agree with you. I don't want the BBC to die. But I don't want the BBC to use its so-called impartiality to actually push deeply partial, biased stories and agendas. Because once people think you're unbiased, you have an immense amount of power to push through really quite questionable material. And I think there have been too many moments recently when we've seen that. And I still think we haven't been given the full story. I'm not a Corbynite. I didn't think Corbyn was a good leader or capable of running the country, but he was a decent human being. And the attacks on him turned him into a devil. Into that poster, I remember, that the Tories produced of Tony Blair. Remember
yes,
the
devil eyes.
They turned Jeremy Corbyn. And it's only Al Jazeera which has done a proper investigation into what happened, who did it, and why. It's called the Labour Files. And I met the makers of those programs recently, and they always used to get work from the BBC, companies and producers and directors. After they made that show, it stopped. It absolutely stopped. So the power behind what we see is really very strong. We need to know the truth about why he was subjected to all that he was subjected to.
Now, the whole thing of woke, and of course woke relates to PC, relates to that between wars accusation, do-gooder. It's extraordinary that this was a great accusation. Being a woke, which Jane Fonda would have said, did say was quite a good thing to be, and doing good is quite a good thing to do, you would have thought, but somehow it was a bad thing to do. Now, the fault of the woke is, of course, at the core of it, the idea of identity politics, the idea of pursuing a politics that comes from a minority hive instead of identity politics, instead of the real thing. And identity politics, it seemed to me, was terribly vulnerable to any sort of sophisticated coverage, because you could find somebody without money or power or very much knowledge who'd say something that sounded incredibly fatuous as directly recorded in a provincial university that nobody had ever heard of, and presented as the product of the metropolitan liberal elite always, and presented on centre pages in right-wing newspapers. And the idea that whatever it was, whatever fatuous things people were saying, was being issued by immensely powerful, deep state-ish, deep university-ish kinds of people. That seemed to be a very well-planned and plotted long-term strategy.
Yes, and it's so, you just have to, as you've described it, you see through it, don't you? But who says this? Have you heard saying this? I
No.
often say I'm woke. I'm very woke.
Yes.
Okay?
Yes. But nobody does say they're woke. No.
Well, I am very proudly woke. But let's go back to the identity politics. It only applies to people of color. It only ever applies negatively to the people of color.
But what about trans people?
And, well, I come to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But on the whole, identity politics refers to these Muslims, these black people and Black Lives Matter. All lives matter, they say. All lives matter.
Yes.
All lives matter, but black lives matter less. So the trick is really, it's not even that clever. Okay. So we are always being, and I am very critical. I am extremely critical of inward-looking communities, minority communities, with beliefs and practices that have no place in the modern world. And I've written endlessly about it. And it's always very interesting to me that I get death threats from white racists as well as Muslim fanatics. So, nobody likes an independent mind. But when it comes to the identity politics of red wall people,
Yeah.
oh, we must respect them. This is a community which feels under threat from modernism. Their way of life is being threatened. How dare the modernists, who are the metropolitan elites, who are forever wanting to break down the walls of ethnic minority, inward-looking communities, of which there are many, but are very careful to keep this wall preserved and well-built and protected and precious. Because, hey, those guys, their belief system, some of the beliefs are truly appalling. We must not say anything about them. The number of times I've spoken up about this and been told off, saying, oh, you hate the people, the real people of this country. You don't understand us. Well, that's exactly what I was told when I criticized Muslims for forcing their children into marriages. You don't understand us. You don't respect us. But it seems to me the inequality plays out here as well. Yeah. It is identity politics for some, not for others. And the trans debate is another perfect example of the duplicity. Okay? A group of feminists, some of them my friends, or were, took it upon themselves to start this campaign. Now, I think the Scottish government did make some mistakes in going too far into the area of, if you say, I'm a man, you are a man. Okay? Life, you can't be. That just creates an extraordinary number of problems. But somebody who has a gender definition certificate didn't get it easily. But what happened was this whole thing was built up initially in the Times by very sensible, very good journalists. And then it kind of began to become, and this is becoming a very common thing, and I've not heard anybody else say it, that increasingly something is set off, sometimes by the liberals themselves on the left or center, and the right grabs the issue. And then you get this unholy bond between those, who were rightly opposed to each other, becoming one voice. And this has happened with the trans issue. So people who I never expected to be quite so cozy with not the far right, but the quite kind of the right as I feel it has been very destructive in multiracial Britain, ganging up against trans people. And I will not go there. I will not join this bandwagon, even though many of my friends are on it. Because I remember seeing this with gay people's rights, when civil marriages were being introduced, when education in school, they wanted to educate children about what it means to be gay, and Margaret Thatcher stamping it out. I remember the hysteria. And so I'm not joining it. But it's really interesting that the people who are not even on the other side, this isn't an issue which you should handle lightly. People have killed themselves. 2 books were written by mums whose daughters killed themselves in the last year or so. because of the way the public debate is going. And so what happens is if you are on their side, you're good and acceptable. But if you're on the other, you are dangerously woke and a threat to the nation. And actually, all my life, I've chosen that other side, sadly.
I'm very fascinated by the existence of what appears to be an implicit group of feminists, some of them lesbians, people of the left sort of over a long time, ganging together into being anti-trans, as if trans people as a whole, every last one of them, was a great danger to women and the social order. One such organisation, which is a pair of, I think, certified radical left-wing lesbians, is now based at 55 Tufton Street.
Is that right?
How can that be? Yes.
Well, you see, this is how it happens. So it's not even left or right anymore. It is, progressives versus used to be progressives who've now become really quite demented conservatives.
Well,
there's a whole new class.
It's a whole new class. And how did this happen? It's rather like some clever commentators I know have pointed out that people who were New Age in a time gone by liked a bit of environmental and a few crystals and things like that. New Age people are very convertible to far rightness. What can they mean by that?
Oh, really? I really didn't know that. But this is what's so interesting. Sandy Toksvig, who's a friend, David Tennant, who I wish was my friend, people we love and admire, right? Billy Bragg is another one. They've stood up for trans people. And my God, the punishment they have had and the punishment they are getting now really is astonishing in what we call a free society. It is extraordinary how this has been allowed to happen. Now, there are trans women, a few of them, prisoners who meant no good by transitioning, some who have attacked women. But, the nonsense that they're invading women's spaces. How are you going to know? You go to the loo as a woman, into a female loo. How do you know somebody in the next loo is a trans unless you ask them to show you their genitals?
Very good point there.
Are we going to do this now? Are we going to have cameras examining the genitals of those of us who are in the cubicles? Are we going to do this in hospital? Where are we going to put trans women into men's wards? The whole thing. I can't tell you how, and I want to stay out of this debate because, lordy lord, enough people hate me already, but I don't add a whole new army of them. But you have to have open eyes and say, most rapes and murders of women are carried out by men.
Men, absolutely. And that in any case, I read the Cass report for my last book because I'd had a chapter on this sort of issue and the attack on trans. And it's an eminently sane document. It keeps itself as far as possible outside of politics, but it does point out, A, that trans people are a vanishingly small part of the population. B, by far the larger group among trans people now are female to male.
Yes.
So they can't be doing too much raping, I would have thought.
Absolutely. Let me tell you something really interesting and sweet. In India and Pakistan, there are groups of trans women called hijras who for 1,000 years have been allowed to live as they wish, dress as they wish. They usually live in little groups. And there is this superstition that unless you invite them to the birth of a child celebration or a wedding celebration, it will go wrong.
Gosh.
So everybody wants a hijra at a celebration.
Oh,
Did you know that?
no. What an interesting idea.
Okay, look up hijra. There you are. So tolerance in a so-called third world country seems more readily available for trans people than in this nation where we proclaim our freedom and are surrendering it minute by minute.
Now, my obsession, if you could call it that, is that so few people know about the new apparatus of disinformation, culture wars stories, all that, which is very, very organised, tremendously well funded, absolutely based in London, here, and Washington there. Very, very metropolitan, very, very elite, but not very, very liberal. That the mechanics of that, which now seem so screechingly obvious to me, are so little known. And you just think, if you were a real person, i.e. not a political geek, if you lived in a real place like Peebles or Paisley or wherever, and you had to put food on the table, you had to get on with your job, you had all sorts of, obligations and distractions and family things and organisations you cared for. And the fact is that in Paisley or Peebles, you would not know any, one, very politicised billionaires, anonymous politicised billionaires. You would not know any political lobbyists or heads of public affairs in big institutions. You would not know anyone who worked at an opaquely funded Westminster right-wing think tank. You would not know anyone who was a political spad. You would not know the political editors of major national newspapers. You wouldn't think any of this stuff was actually happening. Somebody, some wise pollster, asked a national sample what think tanks they could identify. And apparently, only 1% of people could accurately identify a think tank of any kind. Well, that enables lots of think tanks to work in the dark, doesn't it?
Yes, and they have been the force and the conduit for the dark money from America and elsewhere. And, I'm sure if our media did its job properly. But more than that, okay, think tankery is part of the secretive state that I earlier described. But why haven't we got the BBC or any of our newspapers, some do once in a while, doing shocking articles about media ownership? All these guys you've described would be watching GB News. How many of them know about Paul Marshall and his agenda and his aims and what he intends to do with their knowledge, how he intends to nationalize or own their knowledge and shape it? Okay? They know about Murdoch because, interestingly, Murdoch did get scrutinized.
Yeah.
And even had a big drama about him. And the Barclay brothers have been obscure for a long time, but we know a little bit about them. But the new owners, the people who are putting their money to buy political influence and actually buy populations, like the tech bros in America, and here our zillionaires who now, have all the houses they need, the 20 million cars they want. Now they want to own our knowledge and shape it. And none of the ordinary people of this country know who they are and where they made their money from. And I want to see an interview by Amal Rajan with Paul Marshall.
You don't think there's going to be one, do you? Why should that be, I wonder?
No, I don't, because BBC is terrified of upsetting the right. I want to see an interview by, mainstream, The Times, okay, which still is owned by Murdoch. I want to see an interview in the Times with the people who are going to own the Telegraph. I don't know who it is.
No.
But, it becomes media tittle-tattle, doesn't it? Oh, Ofcom is looking. I want a proper investigation into Ofcom, which is led by Michael Grade, whose politics and ambitions, in my view, need to be scrutinised.
Well, Michael is now a Tory peer.
Well, he's been for a long time.
And he used to be a happy show business person.
Yeah, but behind that, there was always... So he has been with Danny Cohen, who was one of the chief honchos at the BBC, attacking the BBC for its coverage of Gaza. They're Zionists who do not want any or it's not even and it's just pro-human coverage of what's happening in Gaza. He and Danny Cohen, as a pair, have been going at them. I want the BBC to interview both of them. Live interview, hour long. Let's find out who they are, what their power is.
Now, for anyone who will be listening to this and asking themselves, who is Sir Paul Marshall? Because I think quite a lot of people still don't know, by contrast with, say, Murdoch, who Sir Paul Marshall is. Sufficient to say that Sir Paul Marshall is an immensely rich hedge fund trader, city-based hedge fund trader, who owns The Spectator because he bought it for 100 million, which was reckoned to be a very, very full price, and owns Unheard, which is a sort of groovy online Spectator for younger people, which has some token leftists occasionally writing on it. Now, it's pretty clear what hedge fund traders do, and it's pretty clear how very rich Sir Paul is because it's in the Sunday Times rich list. He co-owns with somebody I think called Chris Chandler, who is what we intellectuals call New Zealandish. I'm not quite sure what a proper word is for this. And his business is headquartered in Dubai. And they, each of them, Mr. Chandler, who is another, by background, I think it's fair to say, hedge funder, who is alleged to have been very brilliant in making his fortune in 90s Russia. This may or may not be right. They each own 42.2% of that very red wally place, GB News.
Yeah. And they deliberately and constantly, that station deliberately and constantly, there's a wonderful word called, in Swahili, fujo, F-U-J-O.
Oh, that sounds nice.
It means triggering disorder, alarm, anger, and irrationality. So fujo means, that man makes fujo in the market. He comes and he starts up this row and people start shouting and screaming, feeling very emotional. And we have an entire station called GB News committed to creating fujo all the time.
Yes.
And people love it because it's entertaining. It feeds them with anger and rage and hate. Why is this feverish hatred of people on small boats so widespread? And why is that fever going up and not coming down? They don't know these people. They don't know why they're there. They don't know why they're doing what they're doing. If they did, and then they said, I know what he is, I know who he is, I know where he comes from, and I still hate him, that would be fine. But they don't. But night after night, day after day, GB News tells them, these bedraggled people are a threat to the nation because Nigel Farage went out there in his suit and got himself filmed and showed us how the boats were coming in. Okay? So we now have a media sort of just driven by the need to create fujo, panic,
it's a wonderful
anger.
word.
It's a lovely word. I did a whole lecture on it at Oxford last month.
Brilliant. Now, one of the things you've said from time to time You've spoken about finding honesty or good faith in surprising places. Surprising to you, that is. People who come up with things you might not have expected, people who come up with bits of bravery that you might not have expected, and you even described a very good and unlikely conversation with the notably right-wing conservative commentator Simon Heffer.
Yes.
Who surprised you recently when you thought you may be a halfway decent bloke or blokess, despite what I've assumed about you? It's always interesting to find that.
Yes, and it's always important to have an open mind, because one of my closest friends, for example, is Ian Dale, who's a right old Tory.
A previous guest on this podcast.
And people find this very odd and attack him for being my friend. But you have to have an open mind. And I've always said that the old Tories, if you like, the old version of conservatism, there were always people you could talk to, you could argue with, who gave you respect, okay? And therefore you gave them respect. They weren't there to make fujo. They weren't there to bring you down. So it was really interesting. On Question Time, the last time I was there was Robert Jenrick, who is a political hooligan, and Ken Clarke, who is of the sort I am describing. And sadly for the Conservative Party, it's the former who have taken over. And it's impossible for me to find any respect for any of them, because they are ideologues. They are consumed with hatred for the left. They want us never to have a voice, whereas these guys knew what democracy really was. So I've had real rows with Heffer because he did this book on Enoch Powell and hardly attended to the views of black people whose lives were turned over by his speeches. But I think he really likes talking to me, because I was sitting on the train on my own. There was plenty of room. He actually came. We'd been at the Oxford Literary Festival. He sat down, and for the whole journey, we were talking at a really deep level. And he's amazing. He said to me, Winston Churchill, he was a charlatan. How can you not love a Tory who says that? He said he was a great war leader, which I absolutely say before your listeners come for me. But his views were terrible. His views on colonial people, how he treated them, how he saw them as fodder to be used during the war. And as far as Heffer says, he was a charlatan. I couldn't say that. He said it.
Of Winston Churchill?
Yes. Well, he said this to me a month ago. Winston Churchill, he was a charlatan. This was the thing you do not get now, is it's sort of people who are, and I feel the same way about Heseltine. I don't agree with a lot of their views. They all loved Thatcher. I hated Thatcher. Well, actually, Heseltine didn't love Thatcher. But you can have a proper political exchange with them. You can't with these guys, these thugs now.
So they will speak in good faith.
And they say what they believe, and they listen.
Yep.
They do listen. When I told them, because they assumed I was a, privileged girl brought up in a privileged Ugandan Asian family, and how wonderful we are now. And they're forever telling me how much they love Ugandan Asians. And I always say that, but you didn't. You hated us when we came. Here are the speeches. I always have them on hand in my head or in a notebook. Here is what your party said about us. Here is what your followers did when we landed at Stansted Airport. So you didn't love us. Now you do, because so many of us are rich and they fund you. And they like it. They like a spirited conversation.
So they assumed that you were a rich girl?
Yes. And that we were all rich. And then, horrible Idi Amin threw us out, although we were the beating heart of the economy of the country. We were exploiters. Let it be said loud and clear. We were put in the middle by the empire builders, cleverly. So we were the face of commerce, but we were really exploiting the black people whose country it was. And those who got rich on that. Sadly or happily, my father was a total failure as a businessman. So we didn't get to have more than one bedroom.
But you succeeded in spite of all that. You succeeded in getting a fancy education here, which is a good thing, and succeeded in making a late start, as you say, a late start in journalism, having taught, and appearing to be practically a national treasure. Practically, of course, I do consider that you are a national treasure, but appearing to be a national treasure in media terms in the late Blair, early Tory years.
Well, a very tarnished treasure. But I do think I'm incredibly grateful, really grateful, that without any training I stepped into this job with the first column written on an Amstrad. And I, 6 months later I had a job, and I realized I had a talent for writing and arguing. And for that, I really am really grateful to this country. People think I hate this country. I don't. One of my love letter to England is, I think, one of my best books, called Exotic England, which is a love letter.
Yes.
And it says England is not this stiff, narrow-minded, racist nation. England, of all the four nations, is the most curious, the most promiscuous culturally, the most open-minded of the four. And the fact that I can criticize people and the nation and its institutions the way I do, and still be allowed back on the next time, though less and less so nowadays, because it's a very conformist time we're living in. And there are so many Black and Asian people prepared to say what GB News and this unsalubrious Tory party wants them to say. So, I'm much less wanted, but I am still there, and I am incredibly grateful. And it is to do with bravery. You don't owe your nation, your community, your faith, allegiance. You have to speak out when you see injustice. You have to speak out when others are too frightened or precious to speak out. And that's my only gift, I think.
Well, I think there's more. You're being rather modest there. Your ability to laser focus on the issues that matter and then describe them in very, very direct ways, which actually bring audiences up short and think, oh. Now, finally, I've had a few interesting thoughts about things I care very deeply about on this podcast, namely clothes. Blokes saying their favourite bespoke shoemakers and stuff like that. And I've noticed that you do not like a nice frock. And the obligation of people in the public eye is to be at least decently turned out, but I think more than that. And you're an example to us all. What are your favourite looks and places to get them?
Oh, my goodness. I'm going to bring down the tone.
Come on.
Be ready for it.
Yeah.
I would say 50% of my clothes come from TK Maxx.
TK Maxx? Oh.
You have to have an eye.
Yeah.
You have to have the time.
Yeah.
You have to have the greed.
Yeah.
And I've now taught my husband to do this. And he's now more in TK Maxx than I ever am. But none of my clothes, but if you have taste, you can buy something. I'm wearing something which I was wearing yesterday, and people said, "Where did you get this from?" I said, "I can't tell you, because it was Dickens and Jones, which died I don't
ages
know how
ago.
many years ago."
Yes.
But I knew it was a good dress and that I would wear it forever. Do you remember Dickens and Jones?
Indeed I do. It was the old world of Regent Street.
Yes, and it was a fabulous shop. It had designs which were ageless. So most of my clothes are from dead shops.
Yes.
And TK Maxx.
And TK Maxx, which is an extraordinary collection of I think, lost stock from various places, and including some rather smart places.
I have bought cardigans, Vivian Westwood cardigans.
My God.
For £40.
It's a lesson to us all.
Uh-huh. Maybe I'll take you, Peter.
Another
excursion.
Another excursion. I couldn't look forward to something more. And of course, as you say, you've converted your husband and he's in there all the time.
He is.
That's the kind of thing I like to hear. Yasmin, thank you so much for joining my house party to talk about culture wars.
Thank you, Peter.
Keep on appearing. Keep on being there. Keep on saying it.
Thank you. And thank you for having me on.
My great pleasure. Thank you again, Yasmin Alibhai-Brown. Now, in the next episode of my podcast, we'll be having someone very special. Peter York's Culture Wars House Party is presented by me, Peter York, and it's produced by Kate Dixon at Good Egg Productions. Do join me again. Goodbye.